Hello. Okay, so now that the Civil War is over, we're going to go ahead and move on to Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is that period of time following the Civil War where now these two sides that literally were trying to kill each other have to come back together. And even even though they're still going to disagree on many large, very important concepts, they need to come together and just figure out what's best for the country. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a quick video to introduce that.
The American Civil War ended in 1865, and a new conflict immediately began. The North won the First War, the South won the Second. To truly understand American history, one needs to understand how this happened and why. The years immediately following the end of the Civil War, 1865 to 1877, are known in American history as Reconstruction. What should have been a glorious chapter in America's story, the full integration of 3.9 million freed slaves, instead became a shameful one. It began with the assassination of Republican President Abraham Lincoln. 1 week after the Civil War effectively ended, the one man with the political savvy and shrewdness to have guided Reconstruction was gone. His successor was Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat. Johnson was the rare Southern politician who stayed loyal to the Union during the Civil War. Lincoln added him to his re-election ticket in 1864 as a gesture of wartime bipartisanship, but Johnson was wholly unprepared for the task. Under his Reconstruction plan, the defeated rebels would be allowed to return to power almost as if they had never left. The only requirement to rejoin the Union was that they agree to ratify the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery. This was fine with the old Southern Democratic ruling class. By agreeing to abolish slavery, they would actually increase their political power. Whereas the Constitution's old 3/5 clause limited slave states to counting only 3/5 of their slaves for the purpose of determining representation in Congress, after the Civil War, the Southern states were able to count 100% of the freed slaves. This would ensure the return to Congress of Southern Democrats and in even greater numbers than before the rebellion, allowing them, with the help of their Democratic Party allies in the North, to fight Republican efforts to secure the citizenship rights of the former slaves. Johnson's plan set off 3 years of bitter political warfare. The Republicans in Congress created their own congressional Reconstruction plan. Still in the overall majority there, they reorganized 10 of the Southern states into military occupation zones, requiring them to write new state constitutions that recognized black civil rights before they could be readmitted to the Union. Over fierce Democratic opposition, the Republicans also managed to pass 2 new amendments to the Constitution, the 14th and 15th Amendments, guaranteeing due process in law and voting rights in elections. Those rights enabled the former slaves to help elect new state governments, to hold office, and even to send the first black representatives and senators to Congress, all Republicans. Most important, in 1869, with the help of 500,000 votes from newly enfranchised blacks, a new Republican president, Ulysses S. Grant, took office. Grant was solidly behind the Congressional Reconstruction Plan. But a new problem arose. Disgruntled Southern whites organized themselves into ad hoc militias to terrorize Southern blacks and their white Republican supporters into silence. The largest and most famous of these militias went by a still familiar name, the Ku Klux Klan. President Grant fought the Klan and other like-minded terror groups, but the fight required an extended military intervention to keep the peace, and that cost time and money. Grant also had to deal with Northern Democrats who were sympathetic to Southern racism. With each new election, 1868, 1870, and 1872, they gained more congressional seats and more power. And then in 1873, a major financial depression began. Economically desperate, anxious to put the remnants of the Civil War behind them, voters gave control of the House of Representatives back to the Democrats in the 1874 midterm elections. Grant left office in 1877. Soon after, the last Republican state governments in the South were overthrown. Black voters were disenfranchised, Jim Crow racial segregation became the order, and the South returned to social and economic backwardness. What could we have done better? First, we should have imposed a real occupation on the defeated Confederacy until a new political generation grew up in the South which learned a newer lesson about race and rights than white supremacy. Second, we should have gotten land ownership into the hands of the freed slaves and brought the South into the same world of free markets, economic mobility, small-scale manufacturing and industry that Lincoln's Republicans advocated. But the truth is that the North had won the war, but the South had won the peace. That's the real story of Reconstruction. I'm Alan Gelzo, professor of American history at Gettysburg College for Prager University.
Okay, so that kind of gives you a little bit of insight into what we're going to be talking about. All right. So Reconstruction takes place between 1865 and 1877, roughly. The big idea here is Lincoln and Congress differed in their views of how Reconstruction should take place. The end of the war meant freedom for African Americans in the South, but now how to bring both sides together and rebuild and still face those problems that were still there. After the war, much of the South laid in ruins. Soldiers returned to their homes and farms were destroyed. Harvest of corn, cotton, rice, and other crops fell far below the normal level, and farm animals had been killed or they were roaming free and let go. And all of these would be problems the nation would face in their struggle to restore the nation. Remember how when I talked about when we were going through the Civil War, how so much destruction was done in that area. And then after the war, now it's like, okay, who's going to pay to clean up this mess and who's responsible? And now we have to repair it, especially if you're from the North. You were the ones that were destroying it during the war, and now you're going to have to repair it. Reconstruction is the process of readmitting the former Confederate states to the Union. It lasted from 1865 to 1877. It's not a smooth process to bring those two sides back together to form one union. And some of the problems they're going to face are, who's going to pay for those damages in the South? Their economy is in ruins. Their money is shot. Are you going to let those people that were higher up in the Confederate government, can they hold government positions in the United States government now? Do we trust them? What's going to be done? And these are some problems that are there. In the South, the cities, towns, and farms are ruined. There's high food prices, crop failures, and a lot of starvation in the South. The Confederate money was worthless. So let's say you were saving your money if you lived in the South. After the war ends, after they surrender to the North, the Confederate government is no longer put into place. So now that money that you have is literally just paper. There's failed banks, people could not pay their debts, and the South is basically cut off from the world because of all the destruction and damage that was done to the roads and the railroads. Lincoln's plan was that he wanted to reunite the nation as quickly as possible and just put the past behind them. He proposed a plan for readmitting the Southern states before the war ended, and this was the 10% plan. So when it looked like the North could be victorious, he put this plan into play. It offered the Southerners amnesty or official pardon for all illegal acts that supported the rebellion. The Southerners had to do two things to receive amnesty. One, they had to swear an oath of loyalty to the United States. And two, they had to agree that slavery was illegal. Now, if you were from the South at that time, you were going to have a very hard time doing both of those things. Remember, the war did not become a war over slavery until the Emancipation Proclamation. Before the Emancipation Proclamation, it was a war over states' rights. Okay, so they're looking at this as slavery was the way that their economy needed that to survive. So they're not seeing it as a bad thing still. So once 10% of the voters in the state made the pledge, they could form a new government and the state could be readmitted to the Union. The Southern states would then begin to enter the Union. But does it go far enough? Some politicians argue that Congress, not the president, should control the Southern states' return to the Union. Some Republicans in Congress thought the 10% plan did not go far enough. So we have the Wade-Davis bill. There's two Republican senators, Benjamin Wade and Henry Davis, that they had an alternative to Lincoln's plan. They stated that the state had to meet two conditions before it could rejoin the Union. The first, the state had to ban slavery, because at this time, slavery is not illegal yet. And two, a majority of the adult males in the state had to take the loyalty oath. Remember, just males, because no one else really matters. Under the bill, only the Southerners who swore they never supported the Confederacy could vote or hold office. But the problem is, many of the upper class, those with money and power, are the ones that supported the Confederacy. So here you're just going to have, possibly people that are not wealthy, are not educated, that could be playing a role in voting. And those that were wealthy were not for that. The Wade-Davis bill is much stricter than the 10% plan. It made it harder for Southern states to rejoin the Union quickly. And President Lincoln refused to sign that bill into law because he believed his plan would restore the order more quickly. Remember, the proclamation freed the slaves only in areas that had not been occupied by Union forces. So it does not do anything with the border states. They're fine. Remember how we talked about the border states. They did not break away from the United States. They did not go and join the Confederate States. They were okay. And some fear the courts might someday declare the proclamation to be unconstitutional. So Lincoln delivered that proclamation on January 1st of 1863. So I just want you to keep that in mind, what the Emancipation Proclamation did for the war and for the slaves. The 13th Amendment on January 31st, 1865, Congress proposes an amendment that would make slavery illegal throughout the United States. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are known as the Civil War Amendments, and you remember that from our Constitution unit. The 13th Amendment was urged by Lincoln. They ratified and took effect on December 18th, 1865. The abolitionists did not feel that their work was completely finished just because slavery was illegal. Just because it's illegal, what kind of lives will these former slaves have? Frederick Douglass insisted that slavery is not abolished until the black man has the right to vote. So just saying that it's illegal is not enough. We need to give them equal rights to every other person in the country, basically. So there are going to be more changes for African Americans. They held ceremonies to legalize marriages that were not recognized under slavery because their marriages were not recognized when they were slaves. Remember, they were property, not people. They searched for relatives who had been sold away. Some would place newspaper ads seeking information on their children, where they might be. Women would work at home instead of in the fields. They would travel to new locations just because they were able to for the first time ever. And they began demanding the same economic and political rights as white citizens. Now, the former slaves, what are they going to try to do? Well, during the war, General William Tecumseh Sherman wanted to take plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, break them up, and give former slaves 40 acres to farm. They were the ones that made the plantations prosperous, he said. So the plan was to reward them for that, give them some land so they could farm and help themselves to survive. The plan did not get carried out. It gave land back to its original owners, and the freed people were unsure where they would live, what work they would do, or what rights they had. The freedoms they had were difficult to enforce, so this is where you would see many former slaves moving to the North. The Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress in 1865. It was an agency providing relief for freed people and certain poor people in the South. They would distribute food to the poor. They provide education and legal help. And they helped African American war veterans. They would also set up more schools in the South, and they helped establish a number of universities for African Americans. Working adults would attend these schools at night after working all day. And the education would help them understand and protect their rights and to enable them to find better jobs. Remember, I told you when we were going through the Constitution how important it was to know your rights, know what's in the Constitution, know the law, because you don't know what you're entitled to, or if you are possibly breaking the law, if you don't understand the law. Black and white Southerners benefited from the effort to provide greater access to education in the South. Sadly, Lincoln is going to be assassinated, and you would have learned more about this if we were able to take that field trip last month. They're still unsure of how the South would politically rejoin the Union. The president is shot on April 14th, 1865, and dies on April 15th. This took place in Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth is the assassin, which you've learned throughout your years in school. Vice President Andrew Johnson, who is a Democrat, is then sworn into office because remember, back then they didn't do like two Republicans. They would do a Republican and then, whoever did not. Sorry, my screen keeps popping up. Reconstruction became the new president's responsibility. President Johnson was a former slaveholder. He was a Democrat, and he's put on the ticket in 1864 by the Republicans to gain the support of the border states. He is a very stubborn man. Oops, went too far. Sorry for my yawns. This is what happens when I put these together too late at night. I'm tired. His plan for Reconstruction was similar to Lincoln's. He stated that wealthy Southerners and former Confederate officials would need a presidential pardon to receive amnesty, to receive their forgiveness, basically. He would eventually pardon more than 7,000 people in 1866. The new state governments, Johnson offered mild program for setting up new Southern state governments. He appointed a temporary governor for each state, required the states to revise their constitutions, and the voters elected state and federal representatives. The new governments had to declare that secession was illegal because remember, seceding, the states breaking away, that is what caused the Civil War, right? That along with states' rights. And he stated that it would be mandatory to ratify that 13th Amendment, which stated that slavery was illegal. And he did say that they would refuse to pay the Confederate debts. So at this time, is the United States restored? Well, all southern states except Texas had created new governments by the end of 1865. The new representatives went to Washington from each new southern state, and the Republicans were upset because the new reps had been leaders of the Confederacy. This caused Congress to refuse to readmit the southern states into the Union. So at this time, our nation was clearly still divided. That is it for part 1. So go ahead and fill in your notes for this section. Fill in those 10 facts. Thank you.